What is knowledge? Most people would answer quickly, knowledge is what we can prove. It's what we learn in school, what scientists discover in labs, what historians verify in archives. Knowledge is objective, measurable, repeatable. It's data that can be tested and facts that can be shared. In this worldview, the mind is the center of all knowing, and logic is the primary tool for discovering truth. But what happens when you encounter something that cannot be tested or shared, and yet it changes everything? Imagine sitting in stillness, eyes closed, a warmth rises from the base of your spine, your breath deepens, your mind quiets. Then something stirs inside you, a force that feels ancient and alive. It rises like a flame, weaving through your body, illuminating places within you that you didn't even know existed. Your sense of time dissolves, your identity blurs. In that moment, you feel something deeper than words. It's not just an experience, it's a knowing. You didn't learn it from a book, no one taught it to you, but it arrives with clarity and authority. And in that moment, you realize this is truth. Not the kind of truth you debate or defend, but the kind that simply is. The kind that leaves you breathless, the kind that reorders your life. Can such a moment be considered knowledge? In the modern Western world, we've been conditioned to say no. We're taught that personal experience is subjective and unreliable. If it can't be replicated, measured, or observed by others, it doesn't count. But in many spiritual traditions, it's precisely these inner experiences that are the most valuable. They are seen not as illusions, but as revelations. This tension between outer knowledge and inner knowing lies at the heart of spiritual awakening. For centuries, mystics, yogis, monks, and shamans have described profound experiences that transform their understanding of reality. In Hindu traditions, this energy is known as Kundalini, the serpent power, coiled at the base of the spine, waiting to awaken. When it rises, it unlocks levels of perception and understanding that cannot be accessed through reason alone. To the person undergoing the experience, it feels more real than anything they've ever known. But to the outside observer, it's invisible, and therefore often dismissed. This creates a paradox. How can something be real and meaningful if it's only accessible from within? This question has haunted philosophers and psychologists for centuries. William James, in his classic work The Varieties of Religious Experience, argued that mystical experiences carry a noetic quality, a sense of deep insight that feels like knowledge. He acknowledged that these moments are often ineffable and deeply personal, but insisted that they still represent a kind of truth. A truth that cannot be transferred through words, but is no less valid. Phenomenology, the study of lived experience, also challenges the idea that knowledge must be external. Thinkers like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty emphasize that the body is not just a vessel, but a site of perception and meaning. What we feel, sense, and experience is not separate from knowledge. It is its own form of knowing. So perhaps we need to expand our definition of knowledge. Perhaps what we know through the body, through silence, through energy, is just as real as what we know through books and tests. Perhaps truth is not always loud and logical. Sometimes it's quiet and electric. This essay is an invitation to explore that possibility. We will walk with philosophers, mystics, and awakened souls. We will question the limits of logic and listen to the whispers of the body. And most of all, we will ask, is it possible that energy when awakened is not just a sensation, but a form of wisdom? For centuries, Western thought has placed the mind on a pedestal and pushed the body into the background. Knowledge, we've been taught, is born in the brain, crafted through reason, and validated through logic. Meanwhile, the body has been viewed as a mere instrument, valuable only when it serves the intellect. Sensations, emotions, and intuitions have been treated as unreliable, even deceptive. To know something was to remove it from the realm of feeling and place it under the microscope of the mind. But what if the body is not just a vessel for knowledge, but a source of it? What if it carries insights we cannot access through thinking alone? Ancient traditions from across the world suggest this is true. Yogic systems describe the body as a map of energy centers, each linked to emotional, psychological, and spiritual truths. In indigenous cultures, dance, breath, and movement are not just expressions of the soul, they are how the soul learns. When energy begins to awaken in the body, especially through practices like meditation, breathwork, or spontaneous spiritual openings, it doesn't just create sensations, it initiates transformation. A pulse may rise in your spine, a pressure may bloom in your chest, your breath may deepen in ways you can't explain. These aren't just physical reactions, they are messages. The body, it seems, is trying to speak. And if you listen, you begin to understand. Something within you knows. Yet this kind of knowing is fragile in a culture that worships the intellect. You might doubt your experience. You might feel embarrassed to speak of it. And if you do, you risk being labeled mystical, irrational, or even mentally unstable. The rationalist worldview leaves little room for embodied wisdom because it cannot be tested in a lab or verified through external measurement. But lived experience is real, even if it's not repeatable. And for those who go through such energetic awakenings, there is often no going back. Philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty challenged this split between body and mind. He argued that perception is always embodied, that we are never just observers, but participants in reality through the medium of our flesh. The body is not a passive object, it is a way of knowing the world. We move through space, we feel time, we sense meaning not just with thought, but with breath, muscle, and heartbeat. When something stirs within us, it is not less valid just because it cannot be explained. In many cases, it is more valid because it speaks from a place deeper than reason. William James observed this same phenomenon in his exploration of religious experiences. He noted that true transformation often includes bodily signs, trembling, tears, calm ecstasy, or unshakable peace. These, he said, were not just emotional outbursts. They were part of a process of insight, a revelation that passed through every layer of a person, not just their mind. So why does this matter? Because if we continue to ignore the body, we also ignore a vast field of human knowledge. We cut ourselves off from the intuitive, the spiritual, and the unspoken. And we deny the possibility that our deepest truths may not be thought into existence, but felt into awareness. To awaken energy in the body is not a mistake or a malfunction. It is a call, a message, a moment when the veil lifts and the inner world becomes illuminated. Not by data, but by presence. Not by analysis, but by embodiment. And in those moments, what you feel is not just sensation, it is recognition. A form of knowledge that does not need to be proved because it already lives in you. In the early 20th century, psychologist and philosopher William James posed a bold question. What if the most important truths in life cannot be proven, only experienced? In his seminal work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James analyzed hundreds of personal accounts of mystical and spiritual awakenings. He wasn't interested in dogma or theology. He was fascinated by the felt quality of experience, the way certain moments could pierce a person's life and leave behind a sense of deep, unshakable truth. James coined the term noetic to describe these moments. A noetic experience, he wrote, is one that feels like a sudden illumination, not merely emotional or aesthetic, but deeply meaningful. The person doesn't just feel something, they understand something. The insight may not be easy to explain, but it carries a weight that logic alone cannot match. For James, this quality of knowing, this internal authority, was the hallmark of genuine religious or mystical experience. These moments, according to James, often come uninvited. They can arise in silence, in nature, in suffering, or in surrender, and they usually defy language. The person may try to describe what happened, but words fail. What remains is a certainty that something real was touched, something that changes how one sees the world forever. What makes James's work so important to our inquiry is that he treated these experiences seriously. He didn't dismiss them as delusion or fantasy. Instead, he recognized that for the individual, they were sources of knowledge, not knowledge you could measure or teach in a classroom, but knowledge that reorients the soul. In this way, James widened the definition of truth. He allowed for the possibility that not all knowing comes through intellect. Some truths are felt, embodied, and lived. This perspective resonates powerfully with those who experience energy awakenings. When Kundalini rises, when the chakras open, when breath and awareness merge into a moment of boundless presence, it is often described not just as an event, but as a revelation. There's a sense of, I know something now that I didn't before. It may not be verbal, it may not be conceptual, but it's real. Yet in a culture dominated by scientific materialism, such insights are often dismissed. If it can't be repeated under lab conditions, it's not considered valid. But James argued that private, inward revelations are no less valuable than public, repeatable ones. He pointed out that the most important decisions we make about love, morality, vocation, and meaning are rarely based on scientific data. They arise from intuition, conviction, and direct experience. James's openness was radical. He didn't claim that all mystical experiences are accurate or beyond question, but he insisted that they matter not because they prove a universal truth, but because they reveal a personal one. They offer a glimpse into the depths of human consciousness and the mysterious currents that shape our lives from within. To understand the spiritual awakening of energy as a form of noetic insight is to reclaim the dignity of personal experience. It is to say, yes, what I felt matters. It is to trust the knowledge that emerges not from analysis, but from stillness, sensation, and surrender. It is to allow the inner flame to be a light, even if no one else sees it. And in doing so, we begin to heal the rift between mind and mystery, to remember that sometimes the deepest truths are not those we figure out, but those we awaken into. While William James gave voice to the inner authority of mystical states, another philosophical current was emerging in Europe, one that would reshape our understanding of how we know anything at all. This was phenomenology, the study of lived experience. Rather than asking what is objectively true out there, phenomenologists asked a deeper question: what is it like to be alive, here, now, in this body, in this world? Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, proposed that all knowledge begins in consciousness, not in the abstract sense of thought, but in the direct experience of being. He called for a return to the things themselves, meaning that we should not filter reality through preconceived theories or scientific abstraction. Instead, we should pay attention to what actually appears in experience, the way things show up in awareness, in sensation, in perception. This was a radical move. It placed human experience, subjective, embodied, immediate, at the center of philosophy. It suggested that truth is not something floating outside us, waiting to be discovered like a buried treasure. Truth is something we participate in, something we encounter from within the fabric of living. Later thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty deepened this view by emphasizing that consciousness is not disembodied. We are not minds floating in space. We are bodies sensing, moving, breathing beings. And the body is not just an object, it is the very condition for our perception. The body is how we inhabit the world. To touch something, to gaze, to tremble, to fall silent, these are not just reactions, they are modes of knowing. In this light, energy awakening takes on a profound new meaning. When you feel heat rising along your spine, when your breath moves without your control, when your awareness expands beyond the limits of thought, phenomenology tells us not to dismiss these moments as irrational. Instead, we are invited to explore them as revelations of how consciousness itself unfolds. These are not deviations from knowledge, they are knowledge in motion. Phenomenology also insists that every act of knowing is shaped by perspective. There is no view from nowhere. All experience is seen through the lens of embodiment, history, culture, and emotion. This doesn't mean truth is relative or meaningless. It means that truth is always encountered through the lens of human life, and human life is rich, textured, and sometimes mysterious. This understanding helps us recover dignity in experiences that fall outside the scientific frame. A mystical insight, a moment of energetic awakening, or a deep meditative stillness may not be generalizable, but that doesn't make it false, it makes it particular. And the particular is where human meaning lives. To approach awakened energy phenomenologically is to ask not, what caused this, or can it be measured, but rather, what is this like? What does it reveal? How does it reshape my sense of being? These are not easy questions. They require vulnerability, patience, and a willingness to let go of fixed categories. But in that openness, something sacred emerges, not a theory, but a presence. In our age of abstraction and digital overload, phenomenology reminds us that knowing begins not in code or calculation, but in contact, in the breath, in the heartbeat, in the still point where sensation becomes insight. And it tells us that when the body speaks through energy, vibration, or inner silence, it is not noise, it is wisdom, asking to be heard. If phenomenology teaches us to honor lived experience as a source of knowledge, the mystical traditions go even further. They suggest that the deepest truths are not just found in experience, they are born in mystery. In the quiet realms, where language ends and something greater begins, mystics across time have encountered what they call direct knowing, not taught, not deduced, but revealed. In the ancient Upanishads of India, sages spoke of a knowledge that cannot be spoken, only realized. That which cannot be seen by the eye, but by which the eye sees, that alone is Brahman, one verse says. This is not metaphor. It is a pointer to a domain of awareness that precedes cognition, a level of knowing that arises not through thought, but through being. The same insight echoes in other traditions. In Gnostic Christianity, the term gnosis referred to intimate spiritual knowledge, not doctrinal belief, but inner illumination. In Sufi Islam, the concept of marifa described a personal recognition of divine reality, distinct from theological understanding. In Kabbalah, mystical insight was seen as a ladder ascending through layers of consciousness, not just to learn more, but to become more. What unites these traditions is the understanding that knowledge is not limited to the intellect. It includes states of consciousness, inner transformations, and energetic awakenings. In these moments, the seeker does not merely gain information. They encounter a reality that was always present, yet hidden. A reality that reveals itself only when the ordinary mind grows still. Modern spiritual practitioners often describe their first awakening in similar terms. Something shifts. The boundaries of self soften. The body feels spacious, electric, alive in ways it never did before. There is often no clear message, no voice or vision, but an overwhelming sense of this is true. And with it, a knowing that transcends logic. These experiences are often dismissed by modern culture as subjective, which is code for unreliable. But the mystics would argue the opposite. They would say, what is more real than what transforms you at your core? What is more trustworthy than the moment when illusion falls away and you see with new eyes? The challenge, of course, is that such knowledge is hard to communicate. Language can only point toward it like a finger pointing at the moon. If we focus too much on the finger, we miss the moon. This is why so many mystical texts speak in paradox, poetry, or silence. The truth they hold is not meant to be dissected, it is meant to be lived. When Kundalini awakens, it often brings this kind of gnosis. It is not just energy rising, it is awareness deepening, perception expanding, identity unraveling. It is the collapse of ordinary knowing and the birth of something wild, intuitive, and intimate. Those who experience it often say they feel remembered by life, as if some ancient part of them had always known and has finally returned. To honor this is to expand what we mean by knowledge. It is to say that mystery is not the absence of truth, but the doorway to it. It is to accept that some truths cannot be taught, only awakened. And it is to recognize that the journey of knowing is not always up and outward, toward abstraction, but down and inward, into the body, into silence, into the sacred unknown. To the outside observer, energy awakening might seem like a purely physical phenomenon. The body shakes, the breath changes, tears may come. Sometimes there is laughter, sometimes stillness, sometimes unexplainable heat or pressure moving through the spine. From a medical or psychological standpoint, this could be interpreted as nervous system activation, emotional catharsis, or even neurological imbalance. But for the person inside the experience, it feels like something very different. It feels like truth breaking through, not as an idea or explanation, but as a force, a presence, a current that reorganizes not just sensation, but perception, memory, identity, and purpose. This is not energy in the mechanical sense. It is energy as awareness, energy as intelligence. One of the most striking things reported by those who experience Kundalini awakening is the feeling of being recalibrated. The patterns of thought that once ruled them begin to dissolve. Their sense of time softens. Old emotional wounds rise to the surface, not as torment, but as something ready to be released. And through it all, there is a strange inner certainty that this process, however intense or mysterious, is deeply intelligent. This is what makes awakened energy a kind of knowledge. It does not offer facts. It does not answer questions in the conventional sense. But it teaches through direct somatic encounter. It shows you what needs to be healed. It reveals what has been hidden. It strips away false identities and awakens dormant capacities. And it does this not through explanation, but through transformation. In many traditions, this is understood not as pathology, but as initiation, a passage from one level of being to another. In yogic systems, the movement of energy through the chakras is said to awaken specific dimensions of consciousness: grounding, feeling, power, love, expression, insight, unity. These are not abstract ideals. They are lived experiences that emerge as the body is purified, opened, and aligned with the deeper currents of existence. To undergo this process is to be educated in the deepest sense, not taught from the outside, but shaped from within. You learn to trust sensations that once frightened you. You learn to dwell in silence. You begin to discern subtle shifts in energy, attention, and intention. You become more sensitive, not in the sense of weakness, but of attunement. You feel more, and because of that, you know more. Not in your head, but in your being. Of course, this kind of knowing is not always comfortable. Energy awakening often brings chaos before clarity. It may dismantle everything you thought was stable: relationships, beliefs, career paths, even your sense of self. But within that collapse is the possibility of a deeper order. A reorientation toward what is real, toward what is true, not because someone told you, but because it burns inside you like a flame that will not go out. In this light, energy awakening is not a phenomenon to be explained away. It is an invitation to enter into relationship with the mystery of your own being. It is the body's way of saying, there is more to you than you've been told. And when you accept that invitation, you do not merely feel energy, you begin to understand through it. You begin to know with every cell, every breath, every beat of your heart. This is not poetic metaphor. It is a form of learning that precedes language and outlives thought. It is the wisdom of aliveness itself. When energy begins to move within us, something remarkable happens. It doesn't just stir physical sensation, it starts to guide. The more you pay attention, the more you realize this energy has a direction, a rhythm, a will. It knows where to go. It rises, pauses, descends. It opens what has been closed. It reveals what has been suppressed. And it does so with a kind of wisdom that feels ancient, precise, and purposeful. This is perhaps one of the most paradoxical features of spiritual awakening. It teaches you without words. There's no curriculum, no instructor in the room. And yet, the body begins to learn. You find yourself releasing tension without effort. Your breath reorganizes itself. You sit differently, speak differently, even relate to others with more softness or clarity. It's as if something inside you is re-sculpting your nervous system, and it's doing so with deep care. Many people describe this sensation as being guided from within. They don't mean a voice speaking in their head. They mean a felt sense, a current that moves through the body with unmistakable intelligence. It's not always gentle. Sometimes it burns, sometimes it shakes you awake at night. But even in its intensity, it feels intentional. It's not chaos, it's correction. Traditional yogic texts affirm this idea. Kundalini is not just power, she is Shakti, the creative intelligence of the universe, coiled within every human being. When she awakens, she doesn't merely activate energy, she initiates a process of remembrance. She brings you back to your original nature. She dissolves what is false. She awakens what is whole. And she does so in a sequence that is unique to every person, but always in service of integration. This process often bypasses the rational mind. You may not understand what's happening. You may feel confused, emotional, even overwhelmed. But somewhere underneath the confusion is a steady awareness. This is right. This is necessary. Something is being purified. Something is being born. This is not the kind of learning we're used to. In school, we are taught to seek answers outside ourselves, to look to experts, authorities, institutions. But awakening flips that script. It tells you the wisdom you seek is already inside you, not as information, but as vibration, as intuition, as direct perception that does not require validation to be real. Of course, discernment is still needed. Not every sensation is sacred. Not every impulse is true. But when you cultivate inner stillness, when you learn to listen deeply, you begin to distinguish between noise and signal. You begin to recognize the language of energy, subtle but unmistakable. And you realize that your body has always been speaking. You were simply not taught how to listen. This realization changes everything. It makes the spiritual path not a journey of acquisition, but of attunement. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become deeply, exquisitely aware of who you already are. And you do that not by thinking harder, but by softening, sensing, and allowing the intelligence within you to reveal itself. When that happens, knowledge is no longer just something you collect. It becomes something you embody, something you are. You walk differently. You speak with more presence. You begin to live from a place that feels both intimate and infinite because you are no longer guessing at the truth. You are moving with it. And in that movement, you come to see the current of awakened energy is not separate from you. It is you in your most awake, most luminous form. In a world where knowledge is often equated with measurable outcomes and concrete facts, to speak of energy as a form of knowing can seem almost heretical. We are taught to define knowledge in terms of data, logic, and repeatability. If it can't be tested, it isn't real. If it can't be quantified, it isn't valid. But what happens when the most transformative experiences in your life defy all of those criteria and yet still feel unquestionably true? This is the tension that lies at the heart of spiritual awakening. On one hand, the experience is intensely personal. It can't be explained easily, let alone shared or verified by others. On the other hand, it brings with it a clarity, a recognition, and a shift in perception that feels more profound than anything you've ever learned through books or lectures. So what do we call that? If not knowledge, then what? The answer may depend on how we define knowledge itself. If we stick to the narrow scientific model knowledge as external, detached, and universally demonstrable, then no, awakening cannot be called knowledge. But if we take a broader, more inclusive view, one that recognizes the interior life as a valid source of understanding, then yes, awakening is not only knowledge, it is perhaps the most essential kind. There is a kind of knowing that arises from experience, not explanation. It is non-verbal, embodied, and lived. You don't think your way into it, you pass through it. You emerge changed. This is how trauma works and also how healing works. This is how we come to know love, death, birth, and mystery. These events don't teach us by delivering concepts, they transform our inner structure. They initiate us. Energy awakening is this kind of initiation. It reshapes your nervous system, your values, your sense of time, your perception of self and world. It doesn't ask for belief, it simply unfolds. And in the unfolding, you come to know things you didn't before. Not facts, but patterns. Not formulas, but meaning. And that meaning is not intellectual. It is existential. To live through this process is to gain insight that is deeply felt, yet hard to articulate. You begin to see connections between inner states and outer events. You feel guided by something larger than the mind. You learn to trust the subtle movements of attention, breath, emotion. You begin to read the body as a text, rich with symbols, sensations, and stories. You understand without being told. You remember what you never knew you forgot. And that remembering brings peace, not because it solves a problem, but because it ends the search. This is not the kind of knowledge that fits inside a test. It's not something that can be taught in a university. But it's still knowledge if we are willing to admit that knowing has many shapes. This is where Western and Eastern philosophies part ways. In the West, the emphasis has long been on objectivity. In the East, especially within traditions like yoga, tantra, Taoism, and Buddhism, knowledge has always included the subjective. In fact, many of these systems begin with the premise that ultimate truth cannot be known through the mind at all. It must be realized directly, inwardly, viscerally. In these traditions, the awakened body is not a symbol of enlightenment, it is the ground of it. The energy moving through you is not just sensation, it is revelation. It is the universe speaking through the medium of your form. And to listen is to learn. So yes, awakening energy is a kind of knowledge, not the kind that builds machines or maps the stars, but the kind that makes you whole. The kind that reveals the sacred architecture of your own being. The kind that teaches not by telling, but by transforming. And once you've learned this way, it's hard to go back. Because now you know not just in your mind, but in your bones that truth is not always what you think. Sometimes, it's what you feel rising inside you, silent and undeniable, like light breaking through the cracks of an old world. Not all knowledge comforts. Not every awakening feels like light. Sometimes, to truly know, to be pierced by the force of inner truth, is to be undone. The energy that rises within does not simply illuminate your best qualities. It also exposes everything you've buried. It brings to the surface fears, wounds, false beliefs, and unresolved emotions you thought were long forgotten. This is where many people turn back. They expect that spiritual awakening will bring only peace, joy, or bliss. And sometimes it does. But more often, especially in the early stages, it brings disruption. The very structures you once relied on, your identity, relationships, goals, begin to feel fragile, even hollow. You may question your place in the world, your purpose, your sanity. You may grieve not because something was taken from you, but because something false is falling away. This too is knowledge. It is the knowing that arises not from expansion, but from surrender. Not from clarity, but from collapse. You come face to face with the parts of yourself that are afraid, ashamed, unhealed. And you begin to realize the energy is not punishing you, it is purifying you. It is showing you what cannot come with you into the next stage of your becoming. Many ancient traditions understood this phase as essential. In alchemy, it is the nigredo, the blackening, the death of the old self. In Christian mysticism, it is the dark night of the soul. In Buddhist practice, it is the burning away of attachment. These are not metaphors. They are real psychological and energetic thresholds, moments when the illusion of control shatters, and all that's left is trust. Trust in what? Not in an outcome, or a belief system, or even a teacher, but in the process itself, in the intelligence of the unfolding, in the felt sense that even in the disorientation, something deeper is moving, something sacred. To recognize this moment as part of the path and not as a failure is to reclaim your own becoming. It is to accept that the mind may resist what the soul already knows. It is to understand that being cracked open is not the end of knowing, but the beginning of wisdom. In modern culture, we often confuse knowledge with control. If I know what's happening, I can manage it. I can stay safe. But awakening defies that logic. It teaches you to stay present not because you understand, but because you feel. It teaches you to be with yourself, not because you're fixed, but because you're real. And in that presence, new knowing arises, not as a solution, but as surrender. You may not be able to explain what's happening. Others may not understand. You may not even recognize yourself. But you will begin to sense deep down that you are being shaped by something greater than reason. You are being returned to the truth of who you are, not the image, not the persona, but the being beneath it all. And that, too, is knowledge. The kind that doesn't protect you from the fire, but makes you fireproof. After the storm comes stillness, not the stillness of passivity, but of alignment. Once the breaking has passed, once the old forms have dissolved, something subtle yet powerful begins to emerge. You find yourself walking differently, not because you've been taught, but because you've been changed. You speak with more clarity. You listen with more openness. You no longer need to defend your truth. You are living it. This is the phase of integration, when the knowledge born from awakening begins to crystallize into daily life. It's no longer a distant insight or a fleeting spiritual high. It becomes embodied, grounded, real. You start noticing how your breath moves more freely, how your choices come from deeper intention, how you respond instead of react. And most of all, you realize that something within you is quietly, steadily whole. Integration is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives in small ways. A conversation where you no longer take things personally. A moment of silence that feels more nourishing than noise. A decision made from peace rather than fear. These simple acts are signs that knowledge has taken root, not in your intellect, but in your being. What kind of knowledge is this? It's the kind that unifies rather than separates. It doesn't fragment experience into categories or hierarchies. It brings mind and body, self and other, inner and outer, into dialogue. It sees the world not as a set of objects to manipulate, but as a living field to relate with. And in that field, everything becomes a teacher, the wind, the stranger, the pause between breaths. This is not mysticism for its own sake. It is practical, transformative wisdom. When energy awakens and integrates, it begins to inform your sense of timing, your discernment, your ethics. You don't need rules to tell you what's right. You feel what aligns. You know when something contracts you versus when it expands you. And that knowing becomes a compass, subtle but trustworthy. The irony is that this kind of clarity is often invisible to others. On the outside, nothing may seem different. But on the inside, your whole architecture has shifted. You are no longer driven by anxiety or performance. You move from presence. You create from wholeness. You don't need to prove your knowledge, you embody it. This is what ancient traditions have always meant by wisdom. Not accumulated facts, but the expression of inner coherence. A sage is not someone who knows more. A sage is someone who is more aligned, more available, more attuned. And that attunement comes not through striving, but through surrender. Through allowing the body, the breath, and the energy within to become one continuous conversation. Integration also brings humility. You realize that true knowing is not about being right, it's about being real. You become less interested in arguments and more curious about connection. Less reactive, more responsive. Less identified with your stories, more rooted in your stillness. You are not seeking the next awakening, you are learning to live what has already awakened. And in that quiet, humble unfolding, you begin to understand, this too is knowledge. Not explosive, not exalted, but enduring. The kind that doesn't demand attention. It simply is like a tree rooted deep in the earth, offering shade without asking for applause. As the awakened energy settles and becomes part of your daily life, something quiet but profound begins to unfold. Your very presence changes. You no longer need to speak of awakening for it to be felt. You no longer need to explain your experience. You simply are, and in your being, others sense something different. Something spacious, something clear, something deeply human, yet somehow more. This is the power of embodied knowledge. It is no longer stored in your memory or confined to your thoughts. It radiates through the way you sit, breathe, respond, and connect. You walk into a room and bring a kind of calm with you. You meet conflict with steadiness. You hold silence without discomfort. And people begin to feel safe, not because of what you say, but because of what you carry. In spiritual traditions, this is known as transmission. It is the subtle, often unconscious sharing of awakened presence from one being to another. It's not about charisma or persuasion. It's not about performing enlightenment. It's about coherence, the invisible harmony between body, mind, energy, and heart. And when that harmony is stable, it naturally communicates itself to others. Many of the world's great teachers had this quality. You may not remember their words, but you remember how they made you feel. More yourself. Less guarded. More grounded. Less separate. In their presence, something in you awakened, not because they gave you knowledge, but because they reflected what was already waiting inside you. That reflection is the highest form of teaching. This is why integrated knowledge is not private. Even though the awakening may begin as a personal, interior experience, it ultimately flowers into relational wisdom. You become more attuned to others, not to fix them or rescue them, but to meet them where they are. You begin to listen more deeply, to sense what is not being said, to offer space rather than solutions. And in doing so, you become a mirror, not of your ego, but of their essence. What makes this kind of knowing so powerful is that it's non-impositional. It doesn't seek to convert or convince. It simply exists, like a warm fire in a cold room. People come close, not because they're told to, but because something in them longs for the same warmth. And when they leave, they carry a spark with them, not always consciously, but unmistakably. At this point, knowledge ceases to be a possession. It becomes a presence. You no longer have understanding. You are understanding. Not perfect, not complete, but whole in your becoming. Whole enough to let others be where they are. Whole enough to let the mystery keep unfolding. And this, perhaps, is the deepest secret of awakened knowledge. It doesn't end with you. It moves through you. It ripples outward in ways you may never see. A gentle word here, a steady breath there, a soft gaze that says, I see you. These are not grand acts, but they carry the weight of lifetimes. So when you wonder whether your awakening counts as knowledge, remember this. When your presence begins to heal more than your words can explain, you are no longer just a student of truth. You have become its vessel. The final test of knowledge is not how clearly we can speak it, but how fully we can live it. In the aftermath of awakening, after the currents have stirred, the illusions have broken, and the self has reorganized, a question quietly arises. Now what? This question is not about achieving more or becoming someone new. It's about alignment. It's about asking, can I live in a way that reflects what I now know to be true? Can I walk through the world without betraying the silence inside me? Can I make choices that honor the intelligence that now pulses through my breath and bones? This is where awakened knowledge becomes ethics, not the kind of morality enforced by rules, but the kind born from coherence. When your inner and outer worlds begin to match, integrity becomes natural. You no longer tolerate what drains you. You no longer chase what isn't meant for you. You begin to orient your life not around external success, but around inner resonance. This is not always easy. The world is not built to support embodied wisdom. It rewards speed, noise, distraction. It asks you to prove yourself, brand yourself, sell yourself. But the path of real integration is quieter and slower. It asks for depth over display, for truth over comfort, for presence over performance. And most of all, it asks you to act from what you feel, not just what you think. This is what makes awakened knowledge revolutionary. It reshapes not only how you see, but how you move. Your work becomes a form of prayer. Your relationships become places of practice. Even your solitude becomes sacred. You start to notice that life itself is the temple, and your every choice is an offering. In many ancient paths, this stage is known as seva, or sacred service. After awakening, one is called to give not because of obligation, but because of overflow. The knowing you carry begins to want expression in the world, through art, through healing, through teaching, through presence. This giving is not missionary, it is magnetic. You offer because you are full. You speak because silence has ripened into words. And yet you remain humble. You no longer need to prove your wisdom. You are no longer driven by spiritual ambition. You understand that true knowledge does not make you special. It makes you available to love more, to listen better, to be with others in their darkness without trying to fix them. To live what you know is to return to the ordinary with new eyes, to do the dishes with reverence, to feel the sun on your face and remember it as blessing, to encounter a stranger and recognize a soul. This is not escapism, it is embodiment. It is where knowledge finally finds its purpose, not in theory, but in practice. And when you stumble, as we all do, you no longer panic. You don't shame yourself for forgetting, you simply return. You breathe, you feel the current inside you. And you remember, the wisdom is still here, the energy is still moving, the path has not disappeared. It is always under your feet. To walk that path quietly, gently, with deep trust is to live the truth not just in moments of ecstasy, but in every breath. And in doing so, you become a living question, a living answer, a living flame. At the end of the path, something unexpected is revealed. There was no destination. Not because you've learned nothing, but because everything you needed was already within you. The rising of energy, the unraveling of identity, the breaking and rebuilding, none of it led you somewhere else. It brought you home. Home to a knowing that precedes words, to a truth that cannot be borrowed, only lived. This kind of knowledge does not belong to the intellect. It does not come as conclusions or explanations. It arises as presence, as a quality of being that no longer needs to justify itself. You begin to feel it in the way you breathe, the way you sit with silence, the way you touch the world around you. There is no longer a sharp boundary between knower and known. The mind may still ask questions, but the body rests in understanding. Eventually, even the desire to name the experience fades. You don't need to call it awakening or enlightenment or transformation. You don't need to compare it, measure it, or convince anyone of it. You simply live it. And in that quiet lived knowing, you realize truth is not something you arrive at, it is something you embody. In this way, to know becomes a verb of being. It is not about observing from a distance or accumulating mental content. It is about participation, immersion, surrender. To know is to become intimate with reality, to feel the aliveness of the present moment as your only teacher, to walk through the world with a heart that no longer guards but offers, a mind that no longer controls but listens, a body that no longer resists but opens. And from this place, you stop dividing life into spiritual and mundane. You stop searching for meaning in distant places. You realize the sacred is here in the taste of water, in the sound of footsteps, in the way light falls across a wall. Every moment becomes a doorway, every breath a return. This is the final gift of awakened knowledge. It dissolves the false separation between the seeker and the sought. You no longer strive for truth because you are living it. You no longer chase after wisdom because you are aligned with it. You don't need answers because you have become the space where questions are allowed to breathe. And so we return, not in circles, but in spirals, to the beginning. What is knowledge? It is not just information, it is transformation. Not just clarity, but communion. Not just understanding, but embodiment. To know is to become whole, to become present, to become free. And when energy awakens, not as a theory, but as a force that breathes through your every step, you no longer ask if it is real. You simply are.